Welcome to the Energeia podcast, everyone. This is Dr. G joining you as always, and today joining you from out of my Airbnb in Hanoi, the capital of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. And today I am joined by Wim Vandekerckhove. Wim is Professor of Business Ethics at the EDHEC Business School in France and was previously Professor of Business Ethics at the University of Greenwich in the UK. He holds a PhD from Ghent University, where he also previously held a lecturer post. Wim has been a visiting scholar at the University of Oslo, Griffith University, and the International Anti-Corruption Academy in Austria. He has been editor-in-chief for Philosophy of Management and is currently serving as section editor for the Journal of Business Ethics. Wim has provided expertise on whistleblowing, the subject of today's podcast, to various organizations, including the Council of Europe, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the International Olympic Committee, Transparency International, the UK Department of Health, the UK Financial Conduct Authority, and the British Standards Institute. And he was the convener for ISO 37002, the international standard for whistleblowing management systems. So a man that is very deeply embedded in his own area of expertise. Wim, thanks for joining me on the Energeia podcast today. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me, Gareth. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. I actually just gave a class on ethics and corporate social responsibility to my undergraduate Man 101 students. And it felt like I was speaking way out of my own wheelhouse. So it's good to have someone on your background to speak with much greater authority and credibility than I could ever muster on today's topic, which is whistleblowing. But before we get into that topic, I'd just like to invite you to share a little bit about your professional and scholarly background and what the journey was like that led you to this interest in business ethics more broadly, whistleblowing in particular.
Yeah, it's a long story, so I'll try to keep it short. But I think after my high school, I worked for a couple of years. So I did very different jobs. I worked in a number of factories. And I think, I learned there that it wasn't really what I did that made the job fun or made the job suck. It was really about human interactions. It was about the people you worked with, whether you could talk to someone or whether you were wearing earplugs all day, what the relationship with the team manager was. And so I think that was an eye-opener for me. And then I think I also had a job in sales, and there I I sold stuff to people who really didn't need it. And I didn't feel good about that. It's not, do I feel guilty? Well, they didn't have to pay a lot of money, but still, I sort of thought with hindsight, that's the moral disengagement dynamics that I actually met there. So I was really intrigued about that kind of stuff, work life, and whether you felt good about it, you enjoyed it, you were proud of it, or whether you just thought it sucked and it wasn't really what you wanted to do. So I think that intrigued me. And then I went to uni studying philosophy and moral sciences. When I did my master's, I worked for an NGO on human trafficking. We supported victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. And then I got to work for someone who wanted to establish a think tank on anti-bribery, anti-extortion. And this was 1998. And I stumbled upon this in the UK. They had the whistleblowing legislation. I stumbled upon it. I thought, this is fascinating. And so I met a couple of whistleblowers, high-profile whistleblowers at that time. And it just bit me. The topic bit me, and it never let go. And so I went on to do my PhD on that. I've been an academic ever since, but I tried to get away from whistleblowing, but it's just too intriguing. It just sticks. So I think that's, the long story as how I got into business ethics or that aspect. And the whistleblowing was a coincidence, but it stuck.
Yeah, and it keeps pulling you back in, obviously.
Yeah, it does. It does. It really does. Yeah.
All right. Well, we've got a lot to cover, given that you've done so much work in this space, and perhaps just as a way of setting up and grounding our discussion, Could you give our listeners a working operational definition of what a whistleblower is or what the act of whistleblowing is? So how closely does the commonly understood layperson's definition of the term track the construct as it's applied by scholars like yourself? And do the scholarly conceptualizations actually add anything important to the kind of everyday lay common understanding of what a whistleblower is or what whistleblowing is?
Well, I think the common lay on the understanding of what whistleblowing is and who a whistleblower is somehow only seeing the tip of the iceberg. So, and I think, perhaps most common names, I think definitely in Europe, might be Snowden and Julian Assange. Although I think Snowden is, you could say Snowden, that's a whistleblower, whether you agree with it or not, but technically that's a whistleblower. Where Assange, I don't think Assange is the whistleblower. Assange would be closer to what a journalist does, is because it's channeling what whistleblowers tell Assange, and Assange then put it out there. But of course, Assange was incredibly important for whistleblowing and for the renewed momentum that whistleblowing gained since 2010. Definitely. So, but I think, these high profile cases, there's a common they only see the tip of the iceberg because those are the whistleblowers who are in the media. Those are the whistleblowers for whom everything went wrong. There's a lot of whistleblowers that never get to the media. Sometimes because, they raised a concern and internally it was solved, or they raised a concern, internally it wasn't solved, they blew the whistle to the regulator, and then the regulator picked it up and, okay, they remained safe. And sometimes also because people did get retaliated against, they lost their jobs, sometimes their life was destroyed, but a journalist never picked it up because their story wasn't sexy enough. So that also happens. And so if the common lay understanding doesn't see all those aspects. And so I think, more scholarly definition, working definition of whistleblowing or a whistleblower can add stuff because it can make the rest of the iceberg also visible. And the one I like most is also the one that's still mostly used, which is the one from Miscelli and Neer from the mid-80s, which is whistleblowing is a disclosure of information about illegal, illegitimate, or unethical practices under the control of the organization to someone who might affect action. And I think the most interesting aspect there is to someone who might affect action, because it says that someone will disclose information, someone will blow the whistle. It's actually, they call upon someone else to do something because they can't do it. They don't have the mandate, or they somehow don't have the power to stop the wrongdoing they're seeing. So they call upon someone else. And that's in that definition of Miscelli and Neer. It's also very open who that is. It might be a colleague, it might be their immediate manager, might be a regulator, might be the public when they try and go to the journalist. Okay. So I think that's really telling. Another definition by Jubb would say, okay, it's those disclosures that potentially get on public record. So it would be it's only the external whistleblowing to a regulator, to law enforcement. It could become public, but it's not yet public. Okay. But it's not within the realm of the organization itself. And so that's because Jupp would say, because if you also include the internal raising of concern, saying there might be a problem, it's too wide and you can't research it. And I think, the two bits I point out in these definitions, I point these out because they relate to not to the blowing the whistle, but as how do you respond to blowing the whistle? Because for me, that's the really important bit. And to me, it doesn't matter whether you say, oh, whistleblowing is only the external stuff. Because even if you do that, you have to acknowledge there is an internal stuff before that. I would call that whistleblowing as well, maybe softer versions, whatever. But even if you're only interested in the formal whistleblowing, I think you need to acknowledge there's an informal aspect before that. If you want to name that something else, fine. But it's a fascinating aspect as well. Yeah.
Sure. And I think for a lot of people, what you mentioned there about the fact that in the process of whistleblowing, there has to be someone who the whistle is blown to.
Yeah.
Being a sort of crucial piece that's kind of often missed, I guess, from the lay understanding of whistleblowing. And so, throughout your work in this space, you've particularly sought to understand what goes on, not just for the whistleblowers themselves, but also for the targets or the recipients of the whistleblowing. I'm not sure if you'd call them whistleblowees. Maybe that's a neologism on my part, possibly. But were there philosophical, empirical, or practical reasons why you focused your scholarly interest here? I mean, has the literature, prior to you taking an interest in the targets or the recipients of whistleblowing, had the literature up to that point sort of typically omitted or overlooked this perspective and maybe missed something important about the totality of whistleblowing in the process?
Yeah, it had overlooked it. I think, there is, Miscellany and Dworkin did have a publication. I'm trying to think what the year now was. Was it 97? Yeah, there is really great paper on effective whistleblowing, and they put out an interesting model where they actually say that more attention should be paid to the recipient side. I only discovered that later on, or maybe it's one of those things you read it and it's consciously not in your memory, but it is in your memory. So that's probably why I thought, we need to do that. But it just seems from a very practical point of view also to me that, the whistleblower or the whistleblowing wasn't really the problem that needed solving. I never saw the whistleblowing as being the problem. The problem was always that people wouldn't listen or wouldn't take it seriously or would just hit back on the whistleblower out of mistake or out of deliberate, hey, you're a danger to me. I'm gonna kill you while I still can. That kind of reaction. So I never saw the whistleblower as the problem, and a lot of work also in the philosophy space was really looking at the whistleblower and thought that, the big question to answer is, should you blow the whistle? Do you have a moral duty to blow the whistle? And when you speak to whistleblowers, it's not really a problem. It's not really a question they ever faced. It was always quite clear that, yeah, they had to blow the whistle. It was also never really a calculation they made. They sort of, all of a sudden someone said, hey, do you realize that you're a whistleblower? And they said, oh, really? What am I doing? Because I think whistleblowing, typically someone is a whistleblower before they self-identify as a whistleblower, which is probably, if people would realize much earlier on, like, hey, this is whistleblowing and there are risks with whistleblowing, they would do it with more with a better perception of the risks, and so they would be much better at mitigating the risks of their whistleblowing. So I think, the research was somehow, for a very long time, I think, misfooted on that, because it wasn't really taking on the real problems, and that is the literature. Then I mean, the business ethics literature. Miscellany and Near's work was always, that 1985 definition is actually great, because you think about all the misconceptions and myths around whistleblowing. Say, oh, they're disloyal people, but the work of Miscellany and Near very early on already actually shows that, well, no, these might be your loyal employees actually, who might be too naive in being loyal to the organization that they see or that they think there is, but actually, the organization is doing something else. So I do think it was, much of the literature was misguided and focusing too much on the whistleblower. I'll give an example around the importance of explicitly saying the problem we need to solve is handling whistleblower reports. We need to get better at that. It's one of practice. So I was talking to this compliance manager of the big company, so around 30,000 workers, so quite big. He was saying, we have a problem, and the problem is we don't have enough whistleblowing. I said, well, how much do you have? And he said, well, last year we had 16. So, okay. He said, 16 out of 30,000, that can't be enough. I said, what did you do with the 16? He said, well, out of the 16, 4 didn't really have any information. We couldn't do anything with it. And those 12, we started an investigation. And out of those, and 8, we actually found some. So I said, okay, you have a substantiation rate of 50%. And, that seems, what's the problem? And he said, well, it can't be. There must be much more. If you, out of 30,000, there must be much more. So, this guy was fighting the good fight, okay? And I said, okay, so let's imagine that next year there's twice as many. You get 32, 24, you need to start up investigations. He said, no, that's a problem because I don't have the budget. I don't have the resources for 24 investigation. So I said, well, why do you want more? If you want more people to bring you, say, hey, there might be something wrong there, but you can't take all these reports. You can't take them up. You don't have the resources to follow up. So you're setting yourself up to fail. You're setting yourself up to disappoint whistleblowers. And so, if you don't have the appropriate systems to handle it, you shouldn't want any whistleblowers because you can't respond adequately to it. And so that's why I think, organizations really underestimate the importance of doing that. I think today, compliance officers, people who actually have to do it, they know that they need to invest much more and get their systems better, but they need to get their resources from the boards. And the boards, their problem currently is, how do you convince a board that actually you need to put in more resources and being ready to handle someone raising a concern or someone reporting wrongdoing? They still find that very tricky. But it's the handling. It's not the whistleblowing that's a report. It's the handling.
Sure. And it seems like, just systemically, it seems like there's still a lot that prevents people from, or disincentivizes people, I should rather say, from blowing the whistle when it's necessary to do so. And there might be sort of some structural impediments that are still in place that sort of keep people from taking a stand. And I think this is where lay people often hear about the incentive to not blow the whistle. And, a lot of people will make reflexive associations with the fear of losing one's job, their position, their prestige, their standing in the company. But I wonder if there's incentives, perhaps perverse incentives, to blow the whistle. Perverse incentives which are perhaps less commonly known or understood by the wider public and which might bear mentioning. So could just taking the perspective of the recipient here, the target of the whistleblowing, could the possibly irreparable harm that might come from the mere accusation of corporate malfeasance, just the smear of that, even if something's not true, even if there's no substance behind it, could this become a means, or has it, ever become a means of incentivizing nefarious behavior on the part of people who might self-identify as whistleblowers and who might be ostensibly good Samaritans, but who are actually acting in bad faith and trying to undermine the company in a way that's not justified? Are there incentives to whistleblow that are wrong incentives that perhaps the public needs to know more about?
it's an interesting twist on and the good faith, bad faith, and motives of the whistleblower. I think I once heard an integrity professional say, well, don't start your policy with saying we'll protect you, because then people say, oh, my job's at risk and they offer protection, so that's where I'm going to jump. And so I think that's good advice, because also as an organization, you might not be as good as protecting as you think you are. So, but definitely, don't prime people on you'll be protected, because then you'll attract those seeking protection. Whereas, the whistleblower you want is someone who, thinks they're seeing something that shouldn't be happening, and they want someone to fix it. They want someone to stop the wrongdoing. Okay, it's so prime them on that rather than the protection. But beyond that, Gareth, I think one of these, the malicious whistleblower it's one of the myths that I think, for the past 20 years, it's always been their first reaction is, no, 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 malicious whistleblower. It's going to be abused. And so I've learned to deal with it, because the next 20 years will still be fighting that myth. Although, there is research now that actually does show it's a bit of a myth. There's a bit of moral panic around this. So there's a KPMG study in Germany. They asked 700 companies about their whistleblowing systems, etc. And one of the questions they asked was, do you have any malicious whistleblowing, so deliberately false information? And only 4% of the organization says, yeah, it sometimes happens. So it's not 4% of all whistleblowing, just 4% of organizations say, yeah, sometimes I've seen it. So it's actually, it's not the big problem. And I think, before we worry about the whistleblower system being abused, I think we should really worry about, will it actually work? Will it be able to be confidential? Will it be able to protect the people that need protection? Will be able, whatever, if there's an investigation, will the findings of the investigation be followed up on? Because the investigation might be good, but then maybe the board says, well, the wrongdoer is too important for the business. We're not going to discipline them or something. That also happens. So I think those are more important worries. But so that would be my first reaction. The malicious whistleblowing, I think it's a bit of a myth, much more than it is reality. But what is there, what is a reality, is that most of the reports are mixed, in the sense that there is an integrity problem that's being raised, but there is also a personal dimension to the raising. And so there's very good research from Griffith University that would suggest that 47% of what comes in through a whistleblowing reporting line is of a mixed nature. It also suggests that those mixed reports are the ones that tend to go wrong, or more likely to go wrong, because they are miscategorized, so they're mishandled, but also because they are more likely to involve a manager, etc.
All right, and just, when you say they're mixed, just to clarify, when you say they're mixed, do you mean that the quality of information that's being whistleblown on the basis of is of low fidelity or low accuracy, or is there something in the whistleblowing process itself which actually kind of spoils the information or compromises it in some way, or something else?
Well, it would be mixed, because in the sense that, so, and maybe I'm overacting this now, but so if I would make the report, it would say, my manager is cooking the books. He's submitting expenses that's for his girlfriend, and and by the way, he doesn't like me. and we've been having arguments for the last 3 years. So, you might say, oh, Wim's trying to get back, just trying to hit out at the manager. But there's also an integrity element there. So is it personal grievance? Is it integrity? And if you feel that you have to make that it's one or the other, then I don't think that's not the right approach. You would need to say, okay, there's definitely a personal history here, but there's a suggestion of an integrity breach. And let's see whether there's any substantiation of the integrity breach or not. The personal history, it might complicate things that, let's say, there's no substantiation of the integrity breach. Can we solve this personal problem that Wim and his managers seem to have or not? But that would come later. So the personal aspects can complicate things, but I don't think it's not because there are personal problems that the concerns around integrity issues wouldn't be valid. So they are mixed in that sense, and they often go wrong because if they're not pure, if the reporter is not of pure motive, they must be doing it out of vengeance or a personal issue. And I think that's that would be a very wrong approach.
Sure. And I think just to go back to something you said earlier, I mean, it sounds like the trope of the whistleblower who's just a sour grapes, butthurt person with an axe to grind is just that, a trope. It's not actually, I mean, you mentioned 4% of cases earlier. I mean, that's not a very high number for something where I think there actually is a fairly, maybe it's a lay association, but there's this widespread, I think, idea that some substantial number of whistleblowers do just have personal grievances and vendettas that they want to act upon or something, that it's not actually motivated by organizational concern or ethical duty or anything of that nature. So that's a canard.
Oh, it is. And just, I'm thinking now of just to juxtapose two approaches. And this actually comes from managers I've spoken to. These are both people who have an oversight role on their whistleblowing procedures. So I think, an example of the wrong approach, I'm paraphrasing now, but the person was saying, well, of course there are real, genuine whistleblowers. And, the real, genuine is added. Like, you have to be really ethical, right? Not just normal, that kind of wording. But real, genuine whistleblowing, who really deserve protection, etc. Of course, you have to do something for them. But it's basically saying, if the person's not already lost their jobs and their home and their livelihood, then they can't be a real whistleblower. So I'm not going to protect them. And this is the in the internal whistleblowing stage, which is totally crazy. Versus the other approach, and I remember very well, this manager was saying, it sometimes happens that, there's loads of issues brought together with the concerns, and sure, it complicates things, but it is what it is, that's what we work with. And so saying, and most of the time it's not clear cut, but that's my role. That's what I do. I deal with these things. And I thought, like, wow, that was quite impressive how don't panic. Don't problematize someone coming over. It's just, okay, what's there? What can we do? I thought that, very different approaches, Gareth.
Yeah, take it at face value. Beyond the difference between ethicality and legality itself, what differentiates the ethical duty to whistleblow from a legal imperative to do so? So if whistleblowing was mandated and enforced by law rather than merely through ethical expectation, would this potentially give cover for the whistleblowers, even if it's a small sliver of people, like an overblown minority? Would this potentially give cover for the whistleblowers that are in the wrong, whether that's because they may be under a misapprehension or have bad information or they're acting in bad faith? while providing no protective mechanisms for the targets of whistleblowing. So, because you've written about this, you've written, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe your position is that whistleblowing should not be legally enforceable, that it's an ethical duty, it shouldn't be illegal, it shouldn't be based on legal imperative. Do I have your position on that correct?
Yeah, you have that correct. And I think, this also stems from it has a practical basis. If you look at, and I think I'm giving an estimate here. Okay, I might be wrong, vaguely, a little bit, but I think around about 40% of people who raise a concern inside, I think about 40% goes wrong. Now, if on anything, any kind of behavior, if of which 40% goes wrong, you're going to make that obligatory behavior. I think that would be a big mistake. So, and I get what you mean. You say, well, okay, but if you make it an obligation, then maybe from 40%, you might get it to only 4% goes wrong. But I don't see that happening. I don't see how that would happen. I mean, there's been a big discussion whether auditors, who are, they might be self-employed or they work for an auditing firm. And so you audit clients. And so the auditors would be obliged to blow the whistle. I think it's fine if that they are obliged to inform the board about the problems they've seen. Okay, that's part of the job. But if you also say, no, then if they don't listen, you're obliged to go to the regulator. I can get that from a society's point of view. I can get that, yeah, they should be doing this. But this poses a real problem for the auditors. What it would require is a very strong professional body that would say, if you're an auditor and you told the board of your client that they've got problems, they didn't do anything about it, and you didn't go to a regulator, we'll take back your license and you can't audit for the rest of your lives anymore. It would take that kind of strong professional body. And I don't see that happening. I don't think that's realistic. And until we're there, I don't think we can actually say you are obliged to blow the whistle. I don't think that's going to work. I think the other thing as well, Gareth, would be that if you say, let's make it an obligation, a legal obligation for people if they, to speak out, even internally. I'm not sure that's necessary. Because, I mean, in an organization, let's say, you've got 200 employees. How many do you need to speak out? Do you need all 200 to speak out? No, if you have 200 employees and 200 employees have a concern, I think you have a big problem. You might as well close shop. Maybe, how many do you need? Maybe one or two. That should be enough. So you don't need everyone to blow the whistle. I once wrote a blog and the title was, we don't need more whistleblowers. We just need to be better at listening to the ones we have. And I think that's true. We don't really need the obligation. We need to find better ways to pick up the signals that people are giving because they think that's what they have to do. I don't think it's necessary or possible, really, to make it a legal obligation.
And you'd think a greater abundance of whistleblowers coming out of the closet, that can't be a positive indictment on the system that's been set up to encourage whistleblowing. I guess, I don't know if this sounds paradoxical, but I guess a well-functioning system would have fewer whistleblowers coming up with, more damning, dead to rights information rather than lots and lots of people speaking. If lots and lots of people have to blow the whistle, then clearly something's not working about the system that's governing whistleblowing. Or do I have that completely back to front there?
Well, I think it's more. I think that the story's a bit bigger because you have to take into account how a speaking up culture would evolve over time. And so I remember this one company who they had a major scandal, and we did research on that. We have it as a case study in our whistleblowing guidebook. And so they had a massive scandal. So trust levels were really low. And they had to actually rethink the whole structure of their compliance functions, which they did. And so they started a reporting channel. And next to that, they also had an ethics question channel. Okay. And so the person said, well, let's say the first period was people were using the question channel because the scandal was so big that people in the company, they weren't quite sure because a lot of stuff was gray area. And it's like, is this policy? Are we breaching anything? We're not sure anymore. So they were, and it wasn't wrongdoing they see. So they were using the question channel. Sort of also, it's not for me, I'm asking for a friend, that kind of thing. Okay. And so that was used. And they could respond to that. The company could respond to a question about what is policy, okay? And so that sort of word, and people say, oh, okay, yeah, we trust this. So that's also when the reporting channels after that, the reporting channels started to be used more. And they worked through that. And so because that also worked, it sort of got, word of mouth got in the company that, the reporting channel actually works. The organization is responsive. And they said and then, what we started to see that people would actually come into our office. And so they would talk to their local compliance person directly, in person, face to face, without having to go. So I think, that those three types of channels, if you want, the question channel, low threshold, you're not accusing anyone, that kind of thing. Testing the waters, right? You need that, the reporting channel, and then just talk to someone. I think those three and how they balance, I think that's a good measure of where your speak up culture is. But I think it seems that a lot of people still think that it's a numbers game. And I think, well, it's a couple of numbers you need at least. This is a big question. I get the question a lot from compliance people saying, I've got these many reports last year. Is that good or not? It's sort of the wrong question. It's like, where were you last year? That would be a better way to look at the number.
Yeah, it needs a little bit more context. All right. Well, I just want to pivot onto something I've been meaning to ask you about cultural universals, or perhaps the absence thereof, in whistleblowing. So I saw one paper recently that sort of lamented the ethnocentric dominance of Western thought and understanding business ethics. And so I'm just wondering if there are commonly accepted or applied ideas around global business ethics and perhaps jurisprudence generally, and in whistleblowing specifically, which are held up as cultural universals. I wonder how much overlap there actually is between East and West in this, broadly defined East and West in this area, and whether global business has derived its understanding and application of best practice and ideal systems or optimal systems in whistleblowing from a Western, an exclusively perhaps Western business context or model, perhaps to the exclusion of cultural and philosophical business traditions from the East. I wonder what your take on that is.
You're asking a European, of course. So I don't know if I'm convinced I'm not the right person to answer this question, but I can answer how I've looked upon this as a European, of course. And let me first say something about in the whistleblowing space, and then maybe more broadly in business ethics space. In whistleblowing, I sort of, you had these comparisons early on, these cross-cultural studies, and most of them would compare. They would do two surveys, right? One with a US population and one with a population in an Asian or a Central European country. and they would say, oh, the Americans have no problem in whistleblowing, and the others do. I thought, like, this is such bullshit. This is rubbish. This is so unhelpful. Because what it does is, what it suggests is saying, oh, whistleblowing is unproblematic in the US, which is totally not true. It is very problematic in the US, okay? It's damn risky to do. What it also suggests is that, in other cultures, people don't have concerns, They don't look upon practice and say, like, I don't think this is right. Maybe this shouldn't be happening. And I thought, like, this is really unhelpful. So I remember this one, it's a great paper. I forgot the year, but it's by Park and Blenkinsop. And they did a survey in the UK, in Turkey, and I think in South Korea. So very different cultures. But the question, they did not ask, would you blow the whistle? The question they asked was, if you would blow the whistle, how would you prefer to do it? And I thought that's a really helpful question. Okay. You assume that, because it assumes that everywhere people will have ideas and perceptions about this ain't right. Okay. And how would you blow the whistle? How would you raise the concern? How would you prefer to do it? So I thought that this is a much better approach. I still remember, we used to say, in some cultures, corruption is normal and bribery is normal. And then, no, it's not. But in some cultures, people just didn't see, or they didn't have a way to campaign or voice that they didn't really like paying all these bribes. So I still remember it. Bangalore, at a certain moment, there were street protests against the corruption and the bribery that people had to do, even the petty bribery. And so that's just like, so people in India do not like corruption and bribery. What a surprise. And of course, so I think the worries about wrongdoing and seeing wrongdoing, I think is universal. So I'm more inclined to, let's try and find universals, in the sense that another example would be the notion of respect. What we respect differs from culture to culture. How we show respect differs from culture to culture. But I think the notion respect is something that is common to every culture. And so I think that's the sort of approach we need to whistleblowing. In Europe, they would say, the hotline, that's an American thing. It doesn't work in Europe. A telephone hotline for whistleblowing, it doesn't. I remember compliance officers saying, yeah, our company hotline, I call it every month just to check it's still working, because no one is using it. So they use the online, like chat function online, to those systems, or it's talk. They tell the compliance officer when they see them at the coffee machine and say, I didn't tell you this, but here's what you need to know. That kind of. So people do want to raise a concern, but how they do it is quite.
And perhaps if they can do it as well. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking of living here in Vietnam. I mean, it's no secret that corruption and ethical transgressions in business are rife here. There would be plenty of opportunity for people, plenty of material for people to blow the whistle on here in Vietnam. And I take your point, and and fully agree with you that I think anyone here in Vietnam would agree, if they could blow the whistle, they would. That they would be suitably, ethically calibrated and morally compelled to do so. But whether you can actually do it, given the constraints of the system you live under and what threat that poses to your livelihood, if not your well-being, depending on certain cultural contexts, that's a totally different issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's not I think, a lot is down to practicalities and structural aspects, much more than cultural identity and cultural thinking. But having said that, I think for a while I was editor in chief of a journal called Philosophy of Management, and we deliberately we made conscious efforts to get papers from non-Western scholars around philosophical positions or philosophical analysis of management aspects, and that was very enlightening. Maybe use a Western term, but I learned a lot from that. But my take would always be whether in what those non-Western approaches would bring, do I recognize something that I know in that? To give you an example, so very often the notion of ethics in non-Western cultures is said, oh, it's about losing face. So you don't cause someone to lose face. And I thought that's a very different way to phrase it. But I see the same in a very Western practice. Okay. You wouldn't call it losing face or making someone lose face, but there is, you can also see that in practice here. And so I think this, it's great to have different articulations from different points of view. But this notion of cultural identities and that, I don't know. I think we must be careful with the implicit assumptions about people's ethical thinking that sometimes we don't want to make with that.
Sure. I just want to go back, just again, another pivot. You mentioned the word loyalty before, and you've published previously on this concept of rational loyalty as it relates to whistleblowing. Yeah. So I'm just going to quote you directly here from a 2004 paper that you published. So going back a couple of decades, you state that, quote, rational loyalty demands an employee to be loyal to the organization identified in and through the explicit mission statement. The employee does not owe any loyalty towards the organization identified through organizational behavior that runs counter to the kind of behavior described in its mission statement, end quote. So what I thought when I read that is, given that mission statements themselves can often be, sometimes deliberately so, vague and elliptically worded, sometimes just cliched or trite or just, typical corporate boilerplate, can this potentially give justification for people who would otherwise blow the whistle out of ethical duty to not do the right thing? So does it behoove companies to make their mission and value statements very explicitly articulated so that there are very clearly defined, there's no misunderstandings, clearly defined and apprehendable obligations to whistleblow out of rational loyalty, and try to avoid any ambiguities or lack of clarity in their mission statement that someone, I guess an irrational disloyalist, could use as cover or an excuse to not blow the whistle?
Yeah, that paper's a long time ago, and I mean I've had different phases where I thought like, oh gosh, the term rational loyalty, that was a really badly chosen term. I'm not sure, and then I went back and saying, no, actually it's a good choice, because admitting that loyalty is not only a rational aspect, there's also an emotional layer to it. But in the paper, that would just delineate. No, it's just talking about the rational loyalty, insofar as you could distinguish that. It is, of course, a reaction towards the business ethics literature on loyalty and whistleblowing, saying, oh, there's a dilemma here. I've never really spoken to a whistleblower who said like, oh, I had a loyalty dilemma. No, the whistleblower, in the way they identify, is like they are the loyal ones. Right? We wrote about that in a paper with Kate Kenny and Mariano Futaki more recently. There's a passionate attachment of the whistleblower to the organization, right? Because they are the ones who are sort of really true. They are the really loyal ones, and it goes to the organization. Then it's also loyalty to the profession. They are the real professionals. right? Because they stick to the value and the public interest of the profession, and the wrongdoers don't. They just, they're the scam. Okay. But to answer your question around mission statements, I don't think mission statement, the function of a mission statement, I think it needs to be vague. It can't be a very decisive, detailed text that makes it fully clear when people should blow the whistle or not. I don't think that's a function of a mission statement. The function of a mission statement is sort of to give an idea of what are we doing here? What are we about? And so that is vague. I don't think that's really the problem. But there are examples of mission creep. And we're seeing them now with all the greenwashing and all the different other washings in the sustainable development space. There's going to be more whistleblowing around this, right? Again, in the sense of rational loyalty. So, hey, our company is saying that they're working towards net zero, but the way we're measuring it is sort of like, well, we're measuring what's in that building, but not what's in that building. Hang on. Yeah, so we are going to see that, and I think it's a good thing we're seeing that. And I think as companies should be aware that that is going to go on, and they should be more cautious in and maybe what they do with their mission statement. Perhaps not in the formulation. You see, I think the mission statement can be vague as long as it's possible to have an open discussion about how to interpret the mission statement. And I think that's where it's not the vagueness of the mission statement that's the problem. It's a problem if you can't have that internal conversation. A famous whistleblower, Wendy Addison, who does trainings on courageous conversations, would say, you need to be able to have a courageous conversation. It's a difficult topic. You're going to start. You're going to talk about. It's a difficult question, but people need to be able to have those conversations. And I think around how to interpret the mission statement, is practice actually what we're saying we are about? I think that's it's one of the functions of a mission statement, that you are continually having that conversation. So fine if they are vague. I don't think they need to be more detailed.
Sure. Okay. And so just referring to some of your more recent work, you published a paper last year in the Journal of Business Ethics on the European Union's directive on whistleblowing, which was set up to protect and support whistleblowers within the EU's borders. And you discussed this in the context of the concepts of negative freedom and the zone of non-interference. What do these two concepts refer to, and how are they germane to this EU directive?
Yeah, I think how I got there was, of course, freedom, whistleblowing was, again, I think early on in the talk, I mentioned how WikiLeaks has been really important in sort of triggering a new momentum on whistleblowing. And in the way, what it did was, if you look at the period between 2000 and 2010, 2009, you see whistleblowing is really about anti-fraud, anti-corruption. It's in that financial aspect. It's quite narrowed down. Before the 2000, it was about human rights and freedom of expression. And then you have WikiLeaks, and then a couple of years later Snowden, and somehow that really brought a new momentum that whistleblowing was again about human rights and freedom of expression, very much. And so I think that's one of the one of the important things that WikiLeaks actually did. It really brought it up again, and especially in Europe, this whole in the wake of where you had Council of Europe, of course, which is much wider than the European Union. They did pay a lot of attention to Snowden's whistleblowing, and this was around freedom, because Council of Europe is very much around human rights. So it was very much around freedom of expression and sharing information. And that did trigger then the EU's attempts of, maybe we need to look at this as well. And so in the whole discussion within the EU and the European Commission, European Parliament, efforts to develop this directive, it was linked to freedom of expression. So you had this notion, freedom of expression. This has been an area where there is freedom of expression, but for private enterprises, there had been a zone carved out saying, well, freedom of expression, there might be limits to that. And this was about company secrets. And you had a directive, I think 2016 was the directive on business secrets. So you would carve out a zone of non-interference, whereas, you couldn't interfere with the business secret. You couldn't make it public. And in that directive is a very tiny bit saying, there would be exceptions. There would be 3 exceptions for whistleblowers, for journalists, and for union activity. And it's a very tiny aspect, but that actually triggered a very important campaigning momentum in the whole EU directive on whistleblower protection. And I think that also triggered, it's quite unique, the way in which unions and journalists and whistleblower campaigners actually work together in lobbying the EU directive development. But what I did in the paper was actually using those notions, okay, because you had freedom. I went back to a classic, Isaiah Berlin, on work, an essay on 2 notions of freedom. And one of them is negative freedom or negative liberty, where it's very classic. Okay, it's like, okay, my freedom ends where yours begins. It's a very classic Hobbesian idea of freedom, and that, I think, is that characterizes the whole discussion of what is public interest and what's going to be in the public interest, about what topics, what scope. What about you can blow the whistle on, and we'll see this, we'll protect this through this directive. So that's carving out a zone of non-interference. It means that an organization cannot interfere with you sharing information about these issues because they are public interest issues, right? They can't stop a whistle. And then the second problem was around, to who can a person blow the whistle? And initially it was said, they first have to go inside before they can go to a regulator, and only after that they can go to the media. And this was silly. I thought, this is a non-problem, because we know that by far, the vast majority of whistleblowing starts internally. So you don't have to make it an obligation. It already is like that. So yeah. But I saw, like, this is not a problem. But whistleblowing advocates were saying, no, this is a problem. It can't be in the directive. It's okay, it can't be in the directive. Eventually, it wasn't in the directive. So, but that was also a struggle, and it was a very tough one, a very tough struggle to get that. And that's where I used Skinner's more recent Skinner's take on Berlin, and Skinner would say, well, and he takes an example of in England in revolution against Charles I, but his notion is more like, it's not whether someone actually interferes on your autonomy, but it's sort of the knowledge that you depend on someone's goodwill. If you're in that situation, you can't call it freedom. And this was the reality that whistleblowers face. Because, when a whistleblower, when they need to use the legislation, they can't, you want to avoid that they are dependent on the goodwill of a judge to say, yeah, it was necessary for you to skip the internal phase and go to the regulator immediately. And you need to be able to really predict it. If you're depending on the goodwill of a judge, it's not going to end well. this is also the reason why you don't want a good faith requirement in a whistleblowing legislation, because it makes the whistleblower dependent on the goodwill of someone saying it's just too tricky making these judgments. And when a whistleblower has to go to court, there's going to be a character assassination against the whistleblower. Okay, that is the general trend, and so you want to avoid, yeah, the whistleblower being too dependent on the goodwill of someone else in order to be acknowledged as a whistleblower. And so I think that was the second struggle. Okay, that was a philosophically fun to do, but of course, the real issues were those practical struggles, and writing about that in the paper.
All right. Well, speaking of philosophical to-dos, just finally from me, just by way of concluding thoughts, what have you been pondering about where whistleblowing is heading in the future? So are there any particular developments, maybe cultural or technological or societal, cultural, legal developments, which you anticipate might be guiding your scholarship and your work in the years to come? And maybe particularly as it pertains to the recipients of whistleblowing, since this has been such a big focus of your work. What does the future landscape of whistleblowing look like in your view, and what sort of trends or developments are we likely to need to anticipate in the years to come?
Well, one positive evolution which I've seen, I think the last 5 years, would be from my students. I think it used to be, if you say, okay, let's talk about whistleblowing, they would say, oh yeah, snitches, and you would get those reactions, and you would start with an uphill battle already. And I think the last 5 years that is very different. When I say to my students, let's talk about whistleblowing. Do you know any whistleblowers? And they would say, I'm not sure. And I show pictures of recent people in the news, and they say, no, we don't know any. They say, what about these? And say, oh, is that this person? And they say, oh, it rings a bell. They say, yeah. They say, oh, yeah. There are people who report wrongdoing. And so they get it right. So you don't get those negative reactions. So I did want to share that with you, Garrett, that this is a very positive change that I've seen. But I think on the other hand, which more specific to your questions on the recipient side, I think, we need to support our integrity professionals, because in organizations they do understand it. I think that's a change that I've seen the last 10 years. I really meet now, I think most of the compliance officers or integrity professionals I meet, they really get it. Their problem is that their mandate within the organization isn't strong enough. So I think I want to do research that is going to support and sort of make their independence stronger, make their impartiality stronger. That's really that's my aspiration. I think also they can also use help in terms of, because I know you do a lot of coaching. And so I think, you might coach people in this space as well. What I've seen is that they've got very different audiences inside the organization. And I'm not sure they are fully aware that a lot of their problems stem from having to be trustworthy vis-a-vis these different audiences. And so in the space of whistleblowing is they want to be trustworthy to someone who raises a concern. And so in terms of confidentiality that they promise, they might overpromise it, because maybe when they're going to go to their board and say, like, we've got a real problem, the first question the board is going to ask is, who's the whistleblower? And they said, no, I can't tell you. So they've got really pressures from different sides. And so being trustworthy as a whistleblower case handler towards your board requires you to give very different signals than being trustworthy as a whistleblower case handler towards a whistleblower. Also towards middle management, who's going to take everything personal, which is not helpful either. if you want to work on ethical culture. So I think, that's also an area where a lot of I think a lot of help could already be in helping them to analyze what situation they're in. Why are they facing a frustration? Is basically because they're sending signals to different audiences. And if you send contradicting signals, you're left stuck with, having to solve that contradiction there. So I think that's the coming, that's still areas to work on.
All right. Well, it sounds like there's still fertile ground to be covered then. And Wim, this was a fun talk on a fraught topic. And I think with the number of corporate scandals and controversies that we still see bubbling up in the business world, it's probably going to continue to be quite the cottage industry that it is, and quite the focus of scholarly work by the likes of yourself and others for many years to come. I don't doubt there's going to be plenty more work ahead of you. So keep up that good work, I guess, blowing the whistle on whistleblowing, as it were. And thanks again so much for joining me today and for illuminating us all about this topic, which again, just to go back to the beginning of the conversation, I think there is such an imperfect layperson's understanding of what is involved in whistleblowing and what constitutes it in its full totality. So I appreciate you coming on and lending some insight and helping to cover some ground that probably wouldn't have occurred to most people, and certainly didn't occur to me before I engaged with your work. So much gratitude to you for making the time, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Thank you very much, Garrett, for the interest and for inviting me on your podcast. I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. I appreciate it. Thanks so much, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers, Wim.
And it got me thinking.